Thank you, brother. I have a few more pink cards up here. Some of you were asking for some, so they're right up here. I'll put them on the table, and you can get them afterwards. I also want to remind you that you should go to our website and look what's on there. After every sermon, we do what I call 20 minutes, more or less, of what I call prophetic intelligence briefings. These are little news items that you might have missed, cast in their prophetic context. And we put them on CD, but we usually don't have enough room to put all of the little things, little prophetic intelligence briefings on CD. So we also put them on our website, and you can read them there. Also, you can even download our sermons in MP3, or you can get the text and the links for the documentation and the support for the research that we've done on our website. And by the way, our website address is posted on everything we print or publish. It's on our CDs, it's on the little pink cards, it's on the envelopes, the return envelopes, it's on the outer envelopes that come in the post. It's everywhere. So all you have to do is look around, you'll see it. And go there frequently, because we're every day or two updating with more prophetic intelligence briefings that will certainly be a blessing to you and keep you up to date with what's going on in the world from a prophetic point of view. This afternoon, I'd like for you to turn with me in your Bibles to the second epistle of Paul to the Thessalonians. The second epistle of Paul to the Thessalonians, chapter 2, verse 3 and onward. We won't read every bit, but we'll touch on the highlights. 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, verse 3. Let no man deceive you by any means, for that day shall not come except there come a falling away first, and that man of sin be revealed, the son of perdition, who opposeth and exalteth himself above all that is called God, or that is worshipped, so that he as God sitteth in the temple of God, showing himself that he is God. He's self-deceived, as you can see. And then we come over to verse 7. For the mystery of iniquity doth already work. Only he who now letteth will let, until he be taken out of the way. Verse 8. And then shall that wicked be revealed, whom the Lord shall consume with the spirit of his mouth, and shall destroy with the brightness of his coming, even him whose coming is after the working of Satan, with all power and signs and lying wonders, and with all deceivableness of unrighteousness in them that perish, because they receive not the love of the truth, that they might be saved. And for this cause God shall send them strong delusion, that they should believe a lie, that they all might be damned who believe not the truth, but had pleasure in unrighteousness. My friends, this is a very serious and solemn statement. We could spend quite a bit of time on studying this. Today I want to share with you it's a story that is rather, it's found in the first volume of the the first volume of the Testimonies to the Church, concerning an experience that Ellen White and her husband had with the leading brethren in Battle Creek. And it's worth considering at this juncture in our history. It involves three specific dreams and a vision. I call this message the Precession. It has lessons that are poignant for us, especially in light of trials we currently face and will pass through in the near future. I'm convinced that these four revelations were meant for both Ellen White and for us, to explain to her some things about the church she knew in her day, and to explain to us how God's faithful people will be viewed by their fellow church members as we approach and go through the time of trouble. In a sense, the dreams are prophetic. They reveal something about God's way of preparing us for the time of trouble, and they will tell us something about the purposes of God in allowing such difficulties to arise between brethren who should be working unitedly together. One of these dreams reveals the motivation that drives certain human elements in the last days, and the other reveals the divine purpose toward God's faithful commandment-keeping people in the very same events. The brethren in leadership at Battle Creek had become a little unhappy with Ellen because of her reproofs of their plans and attitudes from time to time. Because of their great love for souls and the closing work of God, Ellen White and her husband James had left Battle Creek to labor in parts of northern Michigan against the advice of the leaders in Battle Creek. James had experienced poor health, which kept them both confined at home for some time, and so they were eager to get out about the work of saving souls and building up the churches again. Yet Ellen and James believed that it was their responsibility to work for souls and to strengthen the small churches that were struggling with many issues. Even though James was still sick, and even though the brethren in Battle Creek opposed their departure, they decided that it was time to go out and minister to the churches and people in various places with their witness. So this they did among difficulties of travel. And we think travel is difficult today. But back then it was in a buggy, open buggy, and in this case, during extremely cold weather, ice and snow, and often terrible roads over which to travel. But they felt comfort and strength by the warm reception and good response of the people where they labored. Eventually, James began to get better as he labored by the side of his wife Ellen. Please note that they left Battle Creek without the approval of the leaders. This was not at all appreciated. Perhaps they thought that James and Ellen were too independent and should yield to their opinions. And while they were in northern Michigan, a certain wealthy brother from New York visited Battle Creek and then came to where they were. He had heard negative things about the Whites in Battle Creek, including that James was mildly insane and that his testimony could not be trusted. This he represented to the very people for whom James and Ellen had been working for in northern Michigan and set back their work at least 2 weeks, according to Ellen. Then he went back to Battle Creek and spread negative things about what they were doing up north around to the various families that he visited, representing them in, as Ellen White put it, the most unfavorable light. That's when Ellen had the first dream. She was with a heavenly being. She does not say whether it was Christ or an angel, but it was one of a commanding manner and a dignified deportment. As they went from house to house in Battle Creek, before they knocked on the door, they would listen to the conversation inside. In every house, the subject was the same. The people were discussing the Whites and their work, especially that of James, in a most exaggerated and negative light. The voice of the brother from New York was heard speaking evil of their work up north, while the ones in Battle Creek were relating unkind things that they thought they knew. All of this potentiated the attitudes of the people in Battle Creek beyond reason. The divine being insisted that Ellen needed to hear these things even though they were painful. I want to point out that when there is negativity going on around you, your supposed friends will never tell you about it. They will not first come to you to determine if what they are hearing or what they believe is actually truth or based in fact. You will be treated unkindly, and you will never know why. But everybody else will know and will be prejudiced against you because of it. Even if you ask some of those whom you believe are your friends, they will tell you that they cannot tell you who told them the negative things, because that would be betraying confidences. This, by the way, is a false concept of confidentiality. It is the responsibility of every Christian to be looking after his brother or sister. It is the responsibility of every Christian to help reconcile brethren and sisters, not just potentiate the problem. A true friend will arrange a way in which you can confront the ones who are spreading false rumors. Ellen White wrote, "The person with me," meaning the divine being, "repeated these words. If they would only engage in as readily and with as much earnestness and zeal in in conversation upon their Redeemer, dwelling upon his matchless charms, his disinterested benevolence, and his merciful forgiveness, his pitiful tenderness to the suffering, his forbearance and inexpressible love, how much more precious and valuable would be the fruits." The conversation where Christ and the characteristics of his life are the themes dwelt upon will refresh the spirit, and the fruit will be unto holiness and everlasting life. That's what the divine being said to her in her dream. Eventually, the Whites moved to another district and labored there for a while. But as you know, all was not well in Battle Creek toward them. Previously, during James's protracted illness, various brethren had offered the Whites money to support their work to the tune of nearly $1,000, which was in those days a very large sum of money. James White had always refused this financial support, and he told them that he would let them know if ever he had come into circumstances in which he needed it. When he came into straight places, he sold what he could of his personal possessions to make ends meet. But eventually this was not enough. Then tragedy struck. Perhaps in the providence of God, their only and much needed cow died, leaving them in the most difficult circumstances. James White felt that the time had come to ask for a little help. He wrote to a brother in Battle Creek and said that if the church would esteem it a pleasure to make up the loss of the cow, they might do so. Nothing was done to relieve their necessity, even though the brethren in Battle Creek knew that they knew James well enough to know that he would never ask for help unless he was in the most difficult and needy circumstances. Nevertheless, this innocent act created an excuse for suspicion among the brethren in Battle Creek, which the Whites at first knew nothing about. While the Whites were incessantly traveling abroad, working for God, and dedicating all their energies to building up the church, the brethren in Battle Creek accused James of being insane on the subject of money. And they spread rumors around that alienated the leading brethren in Battle Creek from them. Have you ever experienced anything like that? Rumors go around about you and nobody will tell you what they are. And if they do tell you what they are, they won't tell you where they got them from. And little things potentiate suspicions. Little innocent things. James and Ellen White had suffered much already while on their journeys when letters started coming to Ellen of a very disturbing and discouraging nature. Those are the terms she uses. Apparently, they were advised of some of the rumors going around in Battle Creek, and Ellen White felt a very heavy burden on her heart. Ellen could not sleep at night and was burdened down with grief. She hid her feelings, however, from her husband and from the family with whom they were staying. Ellen White had been aware of the low spiritual condition of God's people, which is always the foundation for unjust criticism and suspicion and disunity. Eventually, they decided to return to Battle Creek. James went back there fully anticipating a warm reception and looked forward to rejoicing in the success of his work with his brethren in leadership. On the way back to Battle Creek, they stopped at a place called Orange and held a meeting. They and the local brethren there were greatly refreshed and by the Spirit of the Lord. But that night, Ellen had another dream. So remember, she had one dream in which it was made clear to her that things were not the way they should be in Battle Creek. People were spreading rumors and discussing things about them behind their backs. This dream was no doubt in the mercy of God, meant to warn Ellen once again of the kind of attitudes they would meet at Battle Creek. But this dream had a different character than the first. This one was not just about personal grievances that were circulating around. It was a revelation of how those personal grievances had matured to the point where the momentum had taken on an agenda. You following me? Little personal grievances can get going, and if they're not resolved, they begin to spread around, and eventually they mature to the point where they take on an agenda. An agenda that was in the spirit of Antichrist and the papacy. The dream she saw clearly identifies this. This dream was also a revelation of the character and spirit that motivates all those who indulge in suspicion against their fellow brethren. That's a warning to us, isn't it? It has the most solemn implications. Here's the dream. She said, I dreamed that I was in Battle Creek, looking out from the side glass at the door, and saw a company marching up to the house, 2 and 2. They looked stern and determined. I knew them well and turned to open the parlor door to receive them, but thought I would look again. The scene was changed. The company now presented the appearance of a Catholic procession. One bore in his hand a cross, another a reed. And as they approached, the one carrying the reed made a circle around the house, saying 3 times, This house is proscribed. The goods must be confiscated. They have spoken against our holy order. Terror seized me, and I ran through the house out the north door, and found myself in the midst of a company, some of whom I knew, but I dared not speak a word to them for fear of being betrayed. I tried to seek a retired spot where I might weep and pray without meeting eager, inquisitive eyes wherever I turned. I repeated frequently, if I could only understand this, if they would tell me what I have said or what I have done. I wept and prayed much as I saw our goods confiscated. I tried to read sympathy or pity for me in the looks of those around me, and marked the countenances of several whom I thought would speak to me and comfort me if they did not fear that they would be observed by others. I made one attempt to escape from the crowd, but seeing that I was watched, I concealed my intentions. I commenced weeping aloud and saying, if they would only tell me what I have done or what I've said. My husband, who was sleeping in a bed in the same room, heard me weeping aloud and awoke me. My pillow was wet with tears, and a sad depression of spirits was upon me. It's quite an impressive dream. Perhaps some of you have read this dream before, but never really thought about the prophetic implications. And so I want to think about this dream for a few minutes this afternoon. there are several very notable features. First, Ellen White recognized those that had marched up to her house, 2 and 2, and she knew them well, she said. These were no doubt her own brethren with whom she and James had an intimate fellowship. Moreover, they were apparently church leaders. After all, ordinary church members aren't usually in a position to make proscriptions of houses and goods. In a historical Catholic setting, it is the church leaders who do this and get the people to cooperate with them. Apparently, the Whites would have had no idea that these visitors were anything other than genuine believers and faithful followers of Christ. Yet they had come to their house on a hostile mission, as evidenced by their stern and determined expression on their faces and by what they said. It's obvious from the 2 and 2 procession that this was a deliberate act. It may even have been related to a formal decision. In the case of Ellen, she had reproved certain of these leaders for certain things they had done, and no doubt some of them were smarting from it. This dream certainly represents the spirit that arises when the spirit of Rome infiltrates the church. The Jesuits, for instance, throughout history are known for sowing discord among brethren and seeding them with the papal spirit. But let us remember that the principles we're discussing are of carnal human nature. The Jesuits simply use that to promote and apply their agenda. When men become suspicious or envious of their fellow laborers, they often resort to the spirit of domination. This is a spirit that can be easily managed by Rome or by its agents. If we want to prevent a slide toward Roman Catholic principles in God's church in the last days, we too must understand this spirit and resist it vigorously. Listen to this statement from Testimonies to Ministers 360 and 361. The holy principles that God has given are represented by the sacred fire. But common fire has been used in place of the sacred. Plans contrary to the truth and righteousness are introduced in a subtle manner on the plea that this must be done and that must be done, because it is for the advancement of the cause of God. But it is the devising of men that leads to oppression, injustice, and wickedness. The cause of God is to be free from every taint of injustice. It can gain no advantage by robbing the members of the family of God of their individuality or their rights. All such practices are abhorrent to God. The high-handed power that has been developed, as though positions make men gods, makes me afraid and ought to cause fear. It is a curse wherever and by whomsoever it is exercised. This lording it over God's heritage will create such a disgust of men's jurisdiction that a state of insubordination will result. Do you think that's happened today? In some cases, perhaps. The people are learning that men in high positions of responsibility cannot be trusted to mold and fashion other men's minds and characters. The result will be the loss of confidence even in the management of faithful men. There's something else to notice about the dream. When Ellen looked the second time out the window, she saw what looked like a Catholic procession. I want to point out that in my experience, those that adopt negative and secretive attitudes will not easily change them. It takes almost superhuman effort to do so. And efforts to correct these things are met with more hostility and greater entrenchment. Here's what happened. James White went to the brethren who had these negative attitudes eventually and apologized for things that he believed he had done wrong, or that things about his nature that would be a stumbling block to them. But this only made them despise him. I'll read it to you. At a meeting with these brethren, James humbly confessed that he was wrong in several things of his nature, which he never should have done. This is Ellen White saying he should have never done that, and never would have done, but for fear of his brethren and a desire to be just right and in union with the church. So what did he do? He actually compromised himself. He apologized for things in his nature that he thought would be a stumbling block to them. This led those, she said, who were injuring him to apparently despise him. We were humbled into the very dust and distressed beyond expression, she said. You ever felt like that? Have you ever felt like the times when you try to make reconciliation with somebody else, it only makes them more angry and hostile and more bitter? In other words, James knew of nothing specific that he had done wrong and needed to confess. But he nevertheless apologized humbly for things in his nature that he imagined might be wrong, or that might be a stumbling block to his brethren. This led his brethren to despise him and gave them justification for their abuse of him. In turn, Ellen White said that he should never have done this. That is a very big lesson to all of us who might suffer some kind of oppression or persecution from our brethren. Obviously, confessing things that aren't necessary to confess is in fact a wrong strategy and will never bring others to see the supposed offender in a proper light. Note, however, the reason he did this was because he wanted to be in harmony with his brethren. And while it had the opposite effect, and though he had a good motivation, general confession of this type can never be the foundation of reconciliation. Often those that suspicion others have no foundation for their suspicions anyway. Therefore, confessing things unnecessarily only worsens the problem, and it gives further justification for their suspicions. There's another important point to understand about this dream. There was a public castigation of the supposed offenders. The Catholic Precession proscribed the house and confiscated the goods while people outside the house were watching. Moreover, this made it so that the suspicion was spread to others, some of whom Ellen White knew and some of whom she did not. That happens, doesn't it? Yeah? Hello? In their eyes, the Whites were discredited because the leaders who had made statements to bring them under a cloud of suspicion. The dream reveals the true spirit behind such manifestations. It is directly from the mystery of iniquity. Suspicion, unjust accusations, and criticism are directly from the spirit of from the mystery of iniquity. It is also the spirit that motivates Rome. It is the rule or ruin principle. Since these leaders could not rule over James and Ellen White, they tried to ruin their reputation and their influence. How often does this happen today? Men who have sweet fellowship with one another become alienated over unjust suspicions, and they suffer under a great cloud of false accusation. In addition, the work of God is damaged in a way. Yet God permits these things for His own purposes, as you will see. Some will work hard and with dedicated heart and soul to do a good work for the Lord. They build a house that is a monument to His truth. Sometimes it's a church. Other times it's an institution. They put their heart into the work. They dedicate their body and soul and sacrificially extend themselves or overextend themselves to build it up. But once it's established, others come along and cast suspicion upon them. And in effect, proscribe the house that they have built. They insinuate evil motives and unjustly criticize their efforts. The result is their goods and their good works are confiscated and cut down or made worthless to those that have built it up. Notice that the reason for proscribing the house and confiscating the goods was because they had spoken against the holy order. In other words, these men have created their own religious order that will not tolerate any opposition or reproof. It will seek to rule or ruin and will attempt to control those who are supposedly under their jurisdiction. This is the spirit of Rome, my friends. Unless we understand it, unless we fight it with all that is within us, it will become the operative principle in our churches and in our homes, schools, and institutions. The cross is the universal symbol of Rome's authority. The fact that one of them was carrying a cross tells us that anyone who uses religious authority improperly is in league or cooperation with Rome, whether they realize it or not. After all, if there are infiltrators, they often work in such a way so that those whom they manipulate have no idea they're under the influence of the secretive powers. Another one of the procession was holding a reed. A reed is a biblical symbol of punishment. The idea presented, therefore, is that punishment meted out on those that do not go along with the existing religious order. Do you think that today there is a religious order that has been constructed that will not tolerate, or that will tolerate no dissent, and that there are psychological and administrative punishments that are meted out against those that oppose them? It happens today, doesn't it? Listen to this famous statement from the pen of inspiration. The enemy of souls has sought to bring in a supposition that a great reformation was to take place among Seventh-day Adventists, and that this reformation would consist in giving up the doctrines which stand as the pillars of our faith and engaging in the process of reorganization. Were this reformation to take place, what would result? The principles of truth that God in His wisdom has given to the remnant church would be discarded. Our religion would be changed. The fundamental principles that have sustained the work for the last 50 years would be accounted error. A new organization would be established. Books of a new order would be written. A system of intellectual philosophy would be introduced. The founders of the system would go into the cities and do a wonderful work. The Sabbath, of course, would be lightly regarded as also the God who created it. Nothing would be allowed to stand in the way of the new movement. By the way, I should point out that this has just made a reference to creation, which is a very big issue of controversy right now in our church. In this new system of philosophy, you see, intellectual philosophy. Nothing would be allowed to stand in the way of the new movement. The leaders would teach that virtue is better than vice. But God being removed, they would place their dependence on human power, which without God is worthless. Their foundation would be built on the sand, and storm and tempest would sweep away the structure. You're familiar with that statement. If nothing is allowed to stand in the way of the new movement, that means there has to be a way to castigate or defame or otherwise punish those who might try to get in the way of the new movement. Today there's a serious attempt to remove the pillars of our faith. One of these is the long-established hostility of those among us in the scientific and academic community to do away with the biblical teaching of creation as a literal, recent fiat creation. 6 days. 6 literal days. This is also a direct attack on the Sabbath, and it is also a direct attack on biblical authority. And if you do away with creation, you overthrow the whole Bible and every detail of the Seventh-day Adventist message. Did you know that? That's the consequences. That's what they're trying to do. Many of those who have opposed these and other doctrinal and practical falsehoods, often promoted by the leaders themselves, have in effect spoken against their holy order, and are and will be treated in the way that is described in the dream, the Precession. Just ask the concerned students at La Sierra University, for example. They were bullied, intimidated, threatened, and stonewalled. The ones that were concerned about the creation evolution issue, the teaching of evolution at La Sierra as the predominant system of philosophy and belief. Now, in the dream, the procession went around the house. They marked out the territory that was to be prescribed. Perhaps symbolically, this refers to the way in which policies are made so that those who hold to the truth and principles of righteousness are excluded from full participation in the church. Did you hear that? The procession, or at least one, the one with the reed, went around the house and marked out the prescription, the territory to be prescribed. Symbolically, this refers to the way in which policies are made so that those who uphold the truth and principles of righteousness are excluded from full participation in the church or in the entity, whatever it happens to be. These policies set the parameters so that anyone outside of them is considered to be an offshoot, an outcast, or at least not a full participating member of the church. You understand what I'm saying? Notice too that in the dream, Ellen went outside of the house, and the people that were there were also suspicious of her. She could not escape the bad feelings and the inquisitive eyes. You know, it's the eyes that reveal suspicion, and sometimes the words. She felt that if she tried to run away, she would be followed and not permitted to have her privacy. She wept as she said, "If they will only tell me what I have said or done." Presumably, she would apologize and change her actions. But the problem is that if she muted her voice of reproof or diminished the truth of God, she would then be an unfaithful servant of the Lord. This is the kind of situation that you get put in. If you mute your voice, then you're unfaithful to God. But if you don't mute your voice, you're being unfaithful to the church, so they say. The normal way in which this goes is that no matter what you do to try and alleviate the personal angst or sanctimonious hostility, it does not go away. Once there has been a determination made that you are not accepted or not to be accepted, you can never overcome the stigma unless you completely abdicate your convictions of the truth you love and uphold. If you compromise on one point, they'll pressure you and compromise on another and another until you have given up all. Even if you have been in a position of responsibility, that doesn't matter. They will bide their time until they can get enough momentum to remove you from office. Listen to this powerful statement about those who start up a work and have borne the burden in the heat of a day. It is from the statement written by Ellen White in 1902. For years, a lack of wisdom has been shown in dealing with men who take up and carry forward the Lord's work in difficult places. Often these men labor far beyond their strength. They have little money to invest in the advancement of the work, and they are obliged to sacrifice in order to carry the work forward. They work for small wages, and they practice strictest economy. They make appeals to the people for means, and they set an example of liberality. They give God the praise for what is done, realizing that He's the author and finisher of their faith and that it is by His power that they are enabled to progress. Sometimes after these workers have borne the burden in the heat of the day and by patient persevering effort have established a school or a sanitarium or some other interest in the advancement of the work, the decision is made by their brethren that some other man might be able to do better, and therefore that he is to take charge of the work that they have been doing. In some cases, the decision is made without giving due consideration to the credit to those who have borne the disagreeable part of the work, and who have labored and prayed and striven, putting into their labor all their strength and energy, and have not failed to, or become discouraged. God is not pleased with this way of dealing with workers. He calls upon His people to hold up the hands of those who build up the work in new and difficult places, speaking to them words of cheer and encouragement. While the workers were straining every nerve to raise means to help them over an emergency, some of their brethren were standing by, criticizing and surmising evil, and put into a prejudicial construction on the motives of the heavily burdened laborers, and making their work more difficult. Blinded by selfishness, these fault-finders did not discern that their brethren are sufficiently afflicted without the censure of the men who have not borne heavy burdens and responsibilities. Disappointment is a great trial, but Christian love can turn the defeat to victory. Reverses will teach caution. We learn by the things we suffer. Thus we gain our experience. There are those who are premature in their desire to reform things that to them appear to be faulty. They think they should be chosen to take the place of those who have made mistakes. They undervalue what these workers have done, while others are looking on and criticizing. And by their actions they say, I can do great things. I can carry forward the work successfully. To those who think they know so well how to avoid mistakes, I am instructed to say, judge not, that ye be not judged. You might avoid mistakes in one point, but in other things you would make grave blunders which would be difficult to remedy, and which would bring confusion into the work. These mistakes might do more harm than the mistakes your brethren have made. Have you ever been in a church situation where you're criticized by your fellow church members? You try to do something and they criticize, and which discourages you and leads you to perhaps even stop the work? I know many, many, many people who have been in that situation. Unjust criticism stifles the church and its mission. The instruction given to me is that the men who lay the foundation of a work and who, in the face of prejudice, fight their way forward are not to be placed in an unfavorable light. If you try to do something, sometimes you stand in defense of the truth, you get criticized and placed in an unfavorable light. There are earnest workers who, in spite of criticisms of some of their brethren, have moved forward in the work of God that God said should be done. Should they now be removed from a position of responsibility, an impression would be made that would be most unjust to them and unfavorable to the work, because the changes made would be looked upon as justification of the unjust criticisms made and the prejudice existing. The Lord desires that no move shall be made which would do injustice to those who have labored long and earnestly to build up the work given them. Friends, if God gives you a work to do, you've got to cease your dependence on man for your inspiration, for your motivation. And while this statement includes some specific references to certain types of circumstances, there is obviously a general application of the principles it contains. If you are going to start a work, my friends, expect to be criticized. If you're going to do something worthwhile for God, expect that others are going to make accusations. It's so easy to become angry or bitter or upset when somebody makes accusations, when it's obvious that this is the way that Satan often works. We should expect it. When it's happened to me, I was sometimes shocked by the things that my friends, or what I thought were my friends, would say behind my back. And nobody would tell me who said it. So I can't go make it right with that person. I can't address it with anyone. And I know from experience how it feels when there are those who stand in unjust criticism of a work that you try to do. Expect it. It goes with the territory if you're going to be a faithful worker for the Lord. And all this is a great trial to those who love the truth for Christ's sake and who have upheld and worked to build it up in their own blood, with their own blood, sweat, and tears. It causes them great anguish to hear the unjust criticisms and the political efforts to remove them from office or from their responsibilities by those who think they know better how to do the work. And unless you've been through it, you can't really understand it. But if you live long enough, you'll go through it. Ellen White looked for sympathy from some of the faces she saw in the crowd. She saw in some a willingness to comfort and encourage her, but they were not willing to say anything for fear of being observed and consequently proscribed, as Ellen White and James White were. Note that there were several, or only a few anyway, that she thought might console her. The fact is that most would not, probably because they were in harmony with the general condemnation and stigma. Today there are many that are sympathetic to the truth and to those who uphold and support it, but they are afraid to be labeled with the stigma that they suffer, that they are suffer, or that they would be suffered to bear. Like in the time of Elijah, there were 7,000 who had not bowed the knee to Baal. They were silent and did not openly support the work of God. Godly Obadiah was doing what he could to help the prophets of God, but he had to do it secretly. The same was true in Jesus' day. When he healed the blind man, his parents were unwilling to openly support what Jesus had done for fear of the Jews. And so it is a common thing for good people to be silent in the midst of injustice and condemnation because they fear to be labeled with a negative stigma. While God does not always condemn this, it nevertheless creates a problem for those that are under the pressure of the spirit of Rome. Ellen White's pillow was wet with tears when she was awakened by her husband. This represents great anguish. And I suspect that many of God's faithful people will have similar anguish as we near the end of time. It is those that weep between the porch and the altar who are going to be saved in the end. Note that to weep between the porch and the altar suggests that it is a public distress. It is a public weeping that is involved. Those that love the truth more than anything else will have this experience that Ellen White had in her dream. That's why I say it's prophetic. If you haven't already experienced it, you certainly will as we get close to the close of probation and the time of trouble. Here's an incredible statement from the Spirit of Prophecy that inclines us to see the reality of this. It's from Testimonies to the Church, Volume 5, page 463. Testimonies, Volume 5, page 463. The work which the church has failed to do in a time of peace and prosperity, she will have to do in a terrible crisis, under the most discouraging and forbidding circumstances. The warnings that worldly conformity has silenced or withheld must be given under the fiercest opposition from enemies of the faith. And at a time when the superficial conservative class, whose influence has steadily retarded the progress of the work, will renounce the faith and take their stand with its avowed enemies, toward whom their sympathies have been long tending. These apostates will then manifest the most bitter enmity, doing all in their power to oppress and malign their former brethren and to excite indignation against them. This day, is just before us. I used to think this experience as in the future, when the time of trouble comes upon God's people. And of course, that's certainly true in the broadest sense. But many have already abandoned the faith. Many have already taken their stand with its avowed enemies. And now they are already manifesting the most bitter enmity and are doing all in their power to oppress and malign their former brethren, whom they now consider to be offshoots or unfaithful or whatever. Many have already joined the spirit of Rome and are now involved in the Catholic procession against those they wish to proscribe. The whites moved on to the next town, and in a few days they had arrived in Battle Creek. There, instead of rejoicing in their work, the whites met with a very cold reception. They had come back home like weary children, as she said, needing comforting words and encouragement, but there was none. The first night, Ellen White had another dream, where sisters who had been helping her fix her hair and adjusting her dress, a symbol of her reputation, but when she fell asleep, they took off her clothes and replaced them with old rags, pieces of bed quilts, knotted and sewed together. The implications are simple. Those who are sometimes your friends, pretending to help you through a problem with your reputation, are actually working against you. In fact, Ellen White said she saw the fulfillment of this dream in Battle Creek. They had to meet the ugly rumors. In fact, there had been letters written all over Michigan disparaging their work, raising questions and giving insinuations against the whites. There was considerable angst about the same things that Ellen White had spoken about at the church at Battle Creek, as if she had spoken against them. They felt that she was against the church. The third dream showed that there were supposed friends who were actually enemies. All of this was in God's providence. It is for a very important reason. When you are dealt with unjustly, when you are criticized behind your back for the things that you do or don't do, when other fellow church members are doing them all the time, when you are trying to do a work and others are trying to tear it down, God is allowing this in His providence for a very important reason. In the midst of all this anguish and struggle, Ellen White remembered a portion of another vision that she had been given more than a year earlier. Here is the vision in her own words. As I was thus thinking, a portion of the vision given me in Rochester, December 25, 1865, came like a flash of lightning to my mind, and I immediately related it to my husband. I was shown a cluster of trees standing near together, forming a circle. Running up over these trees was a vine which covered them at the top and rested upon them, forming an arbor. Soon I saw the trees swaying to and fro as though moved by a powerful wind. One branch after another of the vine was shaken from its support until the vine was shaken loose from the trees except for a few tendrils, which were left clinging to the lower branches. A person then came up and severed the remaining clinging tendrils of the vine, and it lay prostrate on the earth. The distress and anguish of my mind as I saw the vine lying on the ground was beyond description. Many passed and looked pityingly upon it, and I waited anxiously for a friendly hand to raise it, but no help was offered. I inquired why no hand raised the vine. Presently, I saw an angel come to the apparently deserted vine. He spread out his arms, placed them beneath the vine, and raised it up so that it stood upright, saying, Stand toward heaven, and let thy tendrils entwine about God. Thou art shaken from human support. Thou canst stand in the strength of God and flourish without it. Lean upon God alone, and thou shalt never lean in vain or be shaken therefrom. I felt inexpressible relief, amounting to joy, as I saw the neglected vine cared for. I turned to the angel and inquired what these things meant. Said he, Thou art this vine. All this thou wilt experience, and then when these things occur, thou shalt fully understand the figure of the vine. God will be to thee a present help in time of trouble. Can you relate to these three dreams and a vision? I can. You must also have the same experience of James and Ellen White that they had in the days of their ministry. If you uphold the truth, you will be forced to cling to God and be released from human support. This is hard for some people to take. It's hard for most of us, if not all of us. I mean, let's be practical here. It is also emotionally difficult because we expect so much from our fellow man, including our friends. But these are unreasonable expectations, and they are feeble. And God will make sure that you are shaken from them, for the arm of flesh will certainly fail you. Trials and difficulties are for your own good, to separate you from the dependence on human power and support, and place your hand in the hand of God. May God bless you, my friends, and keep you faithful. Trust in God. You have a responsibility. That responsibility is to witness your faith to others, regardless of what other church members think about you, no matter what they say about you, no matter how they might criticize you or even suspicion you. Your job is to carry on God's work. And if you're in a position of responsibility in the church, you have especially been given the responsibility to uphold the truth. But that may bring you into a position where there are those who despise you because of it, and they'll find things they can to criticize you, or cast you out, or reject you, or in some way make your life miserable. These things are as God would have them. Therefore, our own good, so that we may learn to trust in God instead of our human friends and family and church members and anyone else. So God bless you, my friends. May He help you to be as faithful as Ellen and James White were to the calling that God placed upon them. Have you ever experienced these kind of things? Anybody have? Yeah? Sure you have. I have too. And I've learned over the years that if I bind up my emotions in the approval of other people, I am going to be terribly disappointed. And if I bind my emotions to them in such a way as that their approval is more important to me than the approval of God, I will inevitably compromise my faith and leave behind the principles that should be the motivation of my life. So don't turn from this story as perhaps not relevant to you, because it is. Go back to the first volume of the Testimonies. You can read it there. It's rather lengthy, but it is a powerful experience in the time and the experience of Ellen and James White. So may God help us to become faithful and to live by principle There will be a procession. That procession will eventually proscribe you and everything you stand for and everything you've done. But now you know where it comes from. And you know that God can sustain you and help you through that time. Would you kneel with me in prayer?